You're listening to the Ask a Theologian podcast, where we explore the intersection between theology and everyday life. I'm your host, Dave, and I really hope you enjoy today's episode. On today's episode, I had the privilege of sitting down with Dr. Marcia Clarke. Dr. Clarke is currently the president of the Society for Pentecostal Studies. She teaches at Vanguard University in Southern California and is a visiting lecturer at the London School of Theology. As well, her and her husband co-lead New Beginnings Church in Simi Valley, California. We had a great conversation about disruptors, starting right back at the Old Testament book of Judges on through to more current examples such as Amy Semple McPherson. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I think you will too. So sit back, grab a coffee, and enjoy today's episode of Ask a Theologian. Dr. Clarke, welcome to our podcast. Really glad to have you here today.
Good to see you. Good to be here.
Yeah, and you've got good sunny weather down south.
It's
I mean, you're way south of us.
absolutely, it is as it should be. Last week was crazy. I mean, we didn't know what was
Okay.
going on. It was gray skies. I even cooked soup. That's
Oh my, that's bad. Now, for our listeners, I met Dr. Clarke at the first time I've ever been at the Society for Pentecostal Studies, where you were, well, I guess you were the first vice president and program director.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So you move up in rank now. You're the president starting now
Yeah,
or when?
exactly. I became the president once the program was over, the program that you attended in
Right.
March.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
so now I'm the president. Yes.
And Dr. Robbie Waddell is the new uh, first vice president, I guess.
Exactly. Excited
Right.
about his program.
Dr. Waddell was one of my teachers at professors at
Oh my
Southeastern, and he's
God.
actually probably the reason I got to SPS.
Oh,
So
fabulous.
I
Fabulous.
really appreciate him. So, hey, we're good. We want to talk through some things, women in ministry, barriers, disrupting, all that kind of stuff today. And maybe just for a little background, your PhD research, can you just tell us a little bit what your PhD research was in?
Absolutely. So I just background to myself. I grew up in a migrant church in England. My
Right.
parents are Jamaicans and they migrated in search of better economic
Sure.
opportunities. And it was all part of a whole era of time when England was rebuilding following the war. And of course, had
Right.
lost so many of the English young men.
Yeah.
And so needed
Yeah.
people to come over and help rebuild. And so my mom was and my dad was part of that era.
Right.
And when they came, the churches that they attended, the British churches, um, just weren't part of their context. There were some churches that
Right.
were hostile to them
Wow.
as Black people, and as
Okay.
part of all of that, they so there's part hostility. Part is very different from Jamaican way of worshiping. They
Sure.
founded a church called the New Testament Church of God, and
Oh, cool.
um, I grew up in that church, and
Right.
we had fabulous male leaders. My pastor was very, very supportive of women in ministry, supportive of
Right.
me personally. But I recognized that a lot of my spiritual formation was due
Mm,
to the encouragement, due to the prayers, being taught how to pray, being taught how to
right.
fast, even being taught how to do administration within the church. It was by the
Okay.
mothers, it was by the
Right.
women
Wow.
who were in the majority in the
Yes.
church. And so, of course, being in the majority, they did most of the work. And I didn't really intend on doing a PhD. That was not my sort of life intention. I was
Right.
a young mother at the time. I was very happy. I had intentions of being in local government, so I didn't need a
Mm,
PhD to do all of
right.
that. But there came a point when I I met or my husband had his PhD at the time, was working on his
Right.
PhD at the time. And we went to Heidelberg in Birmingham,
Okay.
in Germany.
Yes.
And it was a Globent, another academic conference. And
Sure.
Karen
Yeah.
Anderson was the
Okay.
speaker. And,
Okay.
this was long before his book, Introduction to Pentecostalism. And I'm sure he was
Right.
working on the book at the time. But I
Right.
remember him speaking about Pentecostalism, and
Mm,
one, not recognizing myself in that,
right.
the Pentecostalism that I came out of. And
Right.
later on realizing that, and he also acknowledged that he didn't recognize the
Mm,
place or the part that women played in the Pentecostal movement. And
okay.
so,
Yeah.
so let me be clear, it wasn't the women aspect of my work came about because I really wanted to hold up what women had
Mm,
done for me in
right.
spiritual formation, but also to
Right.
highlight their contribution to the work of building the church in the UK, and also
Right.
because I felt that their spirituality was there was something unique about their
Mm,
spirituality,
right.
and so I wanted to somehow um, elucidate what that might have been. I mean, how do you speak
Okay.
about Pentecostal spirituality? We have books
Right.
written. And so
Yes.
that was so my book about my dissertation was about the spirits and female spirituality, yes, endued with
Wow.
power.
Wow.
Yeah. Mhm.
Wow. No, I haven't been able to get my hands on a copy of it yet, but I'm looking forward to doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully the book will be out this time next year. I'm currently working on the book.
Yes.
So hopefully it will be
Yes.
out this time next year. So it'll
Uh,
be easier. It would be easier to
I
get hold of.
I hear that from an awful lot of people, and I'm going, It's taking too
It
long to
is.
read. I
It
need it."
is really taking too long.
I know even from some of the papers presented, I stayed in the practical theology,
Mhm.
group, and, some of the papers I'm going, "I want that now.
Yeah.
I don't wanna wait till you
Yeah.
publish."
Yeah. Yeah. It is a
But
process. It is an absolute process because even writing revising the dissertation, I'm thinking, what was I thinking then? Why did I even think that? So it is a
I
process.
think ev I think every preacher thinks that when they go back to some of their older
Oh,
messages as
absolutely.
well, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Now,
Yes.
you sent me an outline of a class you did with I think you said with, Dr. Amos Young
Exactly.
at
Yeah.
Fuller,
Yeah.
and, I really loved it.
Thank
I loved how you start off with the idea of disruptors, just the whole, um, idea of well, you start with women
you.
as disruptors.
Yeah.
And, kind of can you explain what did you mean by disruptors and what were they disrupting?
Oh, absolutely. And so we often see disruption in a negative sense. Okay. Because we
Right,
like things as they are. And usually for, different sociological and economic reasons, we don't want things to change. But
right,
disruption is part of the innovation that goes on in our life. And I think about the 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 iPhone or the Android that have
right.
become a major disruption, which now we would not live without. Okay, yeah. We
Yeah,
think about
gladly.
the different social media, the fact that we have a
Sure.
podcast, it has
Yes,
disrupted
yes.
the whole way that communication works, the whole way
Right,
that
true.
knowledge works within
Yeah,
our present society. And so
yeah,
disruption is necessary, and you think about, the older people, who say, in my day, it was, and you could hear them saying, but yet they're on their phone, they're on
exactly.
their tablets, being able to speak to people they've not spoken to for years. They're on their tablet, being able
Right.
to speak to grandchildren and relatives that
Yeah,
maybe they would not have the possibility if it was just about getting on a plane now.
right.
And so
Yeah, that's true.
disruption has both positive and negative, as we know, aspects to it. And so when I talk about disruption, when it uh, pertains to women, um, we see, I think, in scripture and in theological thought that women are placed in Scripture to disrupt the status quo. When
Right.
I think about
Mm.
the midwives, Pure and Shifra,
Right.
that
Yes. Yeah.
and the strength of what they show, but the strength of their belief and their faith in God, to me, it's just
Yeah.
mind-boggling. I mean,
Yeah.
standing up to the commander in chief, standing up to one of the most powerful m- um, authorities
Sure.
in
And he,
their
the
time,
Pharaoh. Yeah.
right? Not just
Yeah.
over their country, but over the known
Right.
world. Standing up and
Right.
say, yeah, yeah, wanted us to kill the babies, but these women aren't like Egyptian women.
Yeah.
And so
I love it.
not only disrupting Pharaoh's plans, but also disrupting what could have been that God's plan
Right.
of the
Mm.
world being blessed
Right.
through
Right.
his people was not
Yeah.
disrupted. It was, and so they stopped a disruption in another way and caused a disruption in another way.
Sure. Sure.
Um,
It seems to be a biblical pattern, though, too, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely
Yeah.
is. But I think part of we overlook the nuances that women
Sure.
play, I think, in
Right.
in that
Right.
biblical pattern. When I read even in Exodus, the whole of those first couple of chapters is
Right.
female
Mm.
focused.
Yeah.
Moses could not come into being, not only because he was his mother, but he could not come into being if it weren't for the Egyptian princess. He wouldn't not come into being
Sure.
if it wasn't for Miriam, and he definitely wouldn't come into being if it wasn't for these midwives. Ordinary
Yeah.
women.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Yeah.
so reflected, apart from the princess, ordinary women are part of this process that makes things um, that changes status quo. Uh,
Wow.
Yesterday I was preaching about Deborah.
Right.
Uh,
I was gonna ask you about Deborah. I loved your comments on her.
yeah. And again, I was looking at the work of Sandra Richter, who's the
Okay.
Old Testament theologian, and she's just done an amazing, innovative Bible study on Deborah.
Mm.
And just thinking about who she was and the time that she was in. And the recognition that there was not we're highlighting the place of this woman. She is the first woman to have, there is none of that. There is
Right.
none of,
Right.
we really wouldn't normally use a woman, but, we can't find a
Yeah.
suitable man. And so, there is
It's treated as a normative experience.
absolutely, absolutely
Yeah.
treated as a normative experience. And, which is important for us to acknowledge that
Sure.
it's
Yeah.
not held up as something that is different or something that
And I really appreciated you highlighting, one, the way in which she's introduced. I mean, the order in which she's introduced.
absolutely,
She's introduced as a judge. She's not introduced as something else.
absolutely
And the other thing that really struck me, and the insights were just amazing to me, is just that when she called for,
correct.
is it Barak?
Well,
Yeah. That she could summon him and he would just immediately come. Just I'd never even thought about that,
yeah, yeah,
and I thought, "Wow, wow." Especially in the context that we're all really familiar with or assume the patriarchal, hierarchy and everything else that goes with that. It's quite remarkable.
absolutely. And so I think we can we can infer that there was a respect not only for her gender, but more importantly, for her position
Yeah.
as judge and her position as
Yes.
prophet. I mean,
Mm.
who says no to the prophet, right?
Yeah. Right,
It will not
right.
go
It's
well
not,
with
"Oh, this is a," it's not qualified by, "This is a female prophet,"
right.
so there's a different set of rules.
Exactly, exactly. And then, she is the only prophet and judge next to Samuel. And
Mm,
Samuel was such an important figure
yeah. Yeah.
in the Old Testament, and so she sort of prefigures Samuel. She is also this prophet leader like Moses, and
Right.
so she is not unique in this in what she's doing
Sure.
in her role. And so I think, she has these great um, role models in Abraham. Yeah, she has these great role
Right.
models in Moses and even in Joshua,
Right.
right? That
Yes.
um, the way that as a prophet hearing from God, there must have been some spiritual formation going on there, and part of that
Right.
also would
Right.
be the
Yeah.
stories of these great men, but also the stories of calling.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
if Yahweh is calling, then we
Hmm.
don't think about ourselves in that. We do, and we do what Yahweh called us to do, and then she
Absolutely.
was well aware of the cycle that
Mm,
the Israelites were in, and she was
right.
part of that deliverance.
Yeah.
And so
Amazing.
it's an important story. I think it's an important story for ordinary women. I think
Yeah.
Sandra Richter brings out the point that this is the only story about her.
Mm,
She
true.
there is no ongoing sagas about who else what other oracles that
Right.
she brought, who else
Right.
she commanded. This is the one story about this woman. And I
Yeah.
think for women, this speaks to the point that you don't have to be always doing great things. Do
Mm.
this
Oh,
one
that's
great thing
fantastic.
that will make an impact for 40 years.
I think it's not just women that need to hear that. Just
Absolutely.
I think just humanity and the church in
Oh,
general just needs to hear
you're
that.
preaching to the choir right here.
Yeah. It was interesting because I was thinking just along that lines that we yesterday, and I wrote a note that we how we measure the church. We tend to measure, seats and finances and all that, but we really missed the whole dimension because our fruit is not momentary. It's over longevity, and we have to measure over time. And we're my particular situation. We're in coming up to our 35th year in this church, and just in the midst of transitioning, handing it over to our successors
Okay.
in 11 months' time. But we just randomly ran into people just a couple days ago that got saved 30 years ago,
Wow.
and recognized us, and we're just grateful, and all of those kinds of things. The
Yeah.
time frame.
Yeah.
You don't have to do one great thing. You just keep doing the good
Just
things.
keep doing the good things. That is such
Yeah.
an important point. And, thank you for your work and, for the lives that you've already touched and will go on to touch,
Oh,
because as
absolutely,
you say,
absolutely,
it's not okay, we start and end. It is a continuum. It's new season. But it's
absolutely.
only when you get to a certain age that you realize, okay, you know,
The season is, yes, it's a certain season, but there's an end date on the season.
and then there is a start date on the new one.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. That's true. You also in that, paper, you talked, though, about, some more modern day, more contemporary, and, is it Jarena or Jarena? Jarena Lee?
Perennially. Mhm.
Jarena Lee, and I think you mentioned Julia Foote in there as well.
As
Um
a passing, yeah,
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 just in
yeah,
passing, and that name stood out to me because of Lisa Bowen's, I don't know if you know Lisa
yeah,
Bowen's book,
absolutely,
African American
yeah,
Readings
uh,
of Paul,
yeah,
which I think is just
it
brilliant,
is, yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
and Lisa's done that. One thing you said about, Zarina that again just struck me, and this is the statement you wrote, I'm just quoting you. "Domestic ideology that placed her in the home, and racist theology that positioned her as naturally inferior to whites," and I know we can go a long ways with that,
Mhm.
but are you saying, I guess, in that Lee is, essentially she's disrupting 2 realms?
I'm saying that.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely saying that, and
Yeah.
I mean, how do you do that? How do you have a pervasive um, culture that thinks about you, that has socialized you to think in a
Yeah.
certain way
Yeah.
about who you are and your
Exactly.
position within that culture?
Yeah.
Um, I think early on I say that there's, that many even within the church felt that um, Black people were devoid of a soul. And so if and having a
Sure.
soul, as you know, is key
Yeah.
to salvation. Because if you don't
Yeah.
have a soul, then there's no need for Jesus to save. And
Yeah. I think Lisa goes into that quite extensively, even to the point of a secondary creation account.
right, right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so this impacted not only the way that evangelism was done within America at that point, but
Right.
also impacted the way that Black people would see themselves. The
Sure.
enslaved and the newly emancipated would see
Right.
themselves. Now, what I think is amazing about Lee and others of her generation is to what was it within them that made them think, no, this is not absolutely correct.
Right.
This is not
Right.
how God sees me. If I'm reading the same
Yeah.
scriptures that you are using to enslave me, there's another part of the scripture that says
Yes.
this,
Sure.
and this.
Yeah.
And so when I think in terms of Lee's initial um, her initial view of herself, that even when
Right.
she heard this Presbyterian minister speaking to her, that she
Yeah.
felt her about the darkness of sin. She felt that within her own self, she was sin itself.
Right.
And which really is for all of us,
Yeah.
but, but
It's
for
true.
her not thinking that she couldn't um, be free of her blackness, be
Right.
free of her
Right.
darkness. But it
Right.
was later on, and I can resonate with the depression that she would have felt,
Mm.
this spiritual wrestling possibly that goes on
Sure.
within her, that you're saying one thing, but I'm holding this thing in myself all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so being able to disrupt that within her individual self, because we don't see her doing
Mm.
sort of civil rights work, but
Right.
yet the civil rights work was going on within herself.
Sure. And I think that's a really important point that the first disruption was actually in her own thinking about
Herself.
herself,
Absolutely.
um,
Exactly.
which
Right.
is really just kinda
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah.
And I think, obviously that speaks into systemic issues, um, and that kind of freedom. I mean, it's an incredible testament to the power of God to bring that kind of freedom to identity.
Yeah.
I loved, how you brought, Amy Semple McPherson,
Yeah.
Mary Woodworth Etter. I've just about finished her massive book, and,
She's
which
amazing.
is
She is
yeah,
amazing.
it's just story after story
Yeah.
after story.
Yeah.
I think, obviously in a different way. I mean, my earlier years was the Catherine Kuhlman, um, but, you made a statement in there that really kinda hit me and said essentially, you talked about that they didn't get involved in the biblical theological arguments, that they transcended the
Yeah.
arguments about female ministry. How did they do that?
Yeah. And I think it's very much the same thing that Jarena had, that
Mm,
you wrestled within yourself. And you make a good point that, disruption begins within the being first, right?
right. Sure. Yeah.
When you think about many of the people that we hold up as disruptors, whether we think about Zuckerberg or, we think about the Microsoft
Sure.
people.
Gates.
Gates, thank
Yeah.
you. When we think
Yeah.
about them, they must have had a disruption within themselves. Can this
Mm,
actually happen? You know,
right.
and they
Yeah,
they
sure.
must have had the dissenters first to say, nah, we have never seen this before. If
Right.
and to be
Yeah. Yeah.
able to overcome those personal obstacles and
Yeah.
to fail and to have people say it's not going to work and to be turned down and to, it begins within the self first.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and for these women, I think there is very much this similarity that is is led by the Spirit,
Hmm.
because their work is a social. That little bit by little bit, if we said earlier when we talked about your contribution to the spiritual
Right. Sure.
formation,
Yeah.
that it's doing little things often,
Right.
right? And I
Right.
think this is what Semple McPherson, Amy Semple McPherson and
Right.
Woodworth Etter did over
Yeah.
years. You know what this is, that you can read a book in 3 or 4 days, and but it's a
Sure. Yeah.
lifetime that it's
Right.
taken to actually come to this place of it's little bit by little bit. Semple McPherson's um, story is such a sad one at the beginning. I mean, how many
Yes.
people
It is.
bounce back from that?
Losing your husband, and yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
losing a
Yeah.
husband. So bouncing back from that, um, and then recognizing God's call on your life. The same with Woodworth Etter, losing, so many of her children, her husband,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
bouncing, not even bouncing back, but moving on from that. To-
Right. A thought that kind of occurs to me when I think about these two particular is, when we look at Lee, she deals with the gender issue, but also the race issue. But Semple McPherson and Woodworth Etter, they were facing the gender issue too, but
Absolutely.
they were also divorcees
Yes,
in a
absolutely.
in a very very legalistic view of that
Mhm,
too.
mhm, mhm.
So, in a sense, they were disrupting, a view of, value in a divorcee.
Sure. And
Yeah.
again, within that context, being married was valued, you
Yes.
know,
Yeah.
um, that you did everything out of the authority of your husband.
Right.
So they were even
Right.
speaking to the okay, I don't think
Yeah.
either of them were anti-marriage, but
No.
I think a
No.
meta narrative possibly is that the only authority is God's, the real authority
Yeah.
is God's
Yeah.
authority, that I'm not given permission to do what I'm doing out of my husband. Do,
Right.
I'm doing that out of a calling that God has on my life. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that speaks, yeah, it speaks volumes even in that what was happening was not, um, was spirit motivated in a time
Yeah.
when women did not lead.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think the sense that I got from your paper, your discussion was that they just didn't engage into the, "Am I allowed to do this? Not allowed
Yeah,
to do
yeah,
this?" It
yeah,
was,
yeah.
I guess I would say they had a practice of leadership without having a theology of it that they were sharing.
I think so. I think so. And it goes back to Deborah, right?
Mhm.
That we're not asking permission to do this because
Right.
we're being called to do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Deborah, we don't see her asking permission,
Right.
We see
Right.
her doing what she was called to do. We see
Right.
people, and not only doing what she was called to do, but people recognizing, which I think is key in any
Yeah.
ministry, in any
Very, very
calling,
interesting. Yeah, absolutely.
right?
I think, I had a conversation with Susan Maris
Mm,
a little while ago,
yeah,
and we were talking about calling and
yeah,
context and how context, we need to understand. So when we look at Deborah's context,
yeah,
um, there probably wasn't any real good reason for her to hear the voice of God if the context dictated it.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Because if um, and yet the context dictated a disruption. The context dictated that
Yeah.
they needed a
Yeah.
deliverer. And
Yeah.
You're it right
Yeah.
now. It will
Yeah.
be somebody
Yeah.
else afterwards, but right now, you're it. And I'm thinking that with Deborah, Amy Semple, again, we talked about this earlier, that there was no run up, there was no affirmative action that we see
Yeah.
happening, right? In
Right.
order to prepare
Right.
the way for Deborah's work, we see her appear. What
Yes.
the context in which she appears is that the children of the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They were oppressed, and the Lord heard their cry and rose her up.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
context. And that was the
Yeah.
context for all the judges. And we see
Right.
with Amy Semple McPherson, we see with Woodworth Etter, a change in Victorian values and culture.
Mm.
That was almost, might I say, um, bondage for women, right?
Yes.
Women in
Sure. Yeah.
ministry. And in the
Yeah.
midst of that bondage over gender, and in Leah Payne's brilliant book,
Yeah.
where the culture was such that it, quote unquote, enslaved women, because they were the properties of their husbands, that they
Right.
didn't have
Right.
the right
Sure.
to vote, and out of this we see Amy Semple McPherson. Out of this, we
Right.
see Woodworth Etter come out, not arguing whether or not they should or should not be there.
Right.
And I think the
Right.
theological, again, from Payne's book, their theological premise was that in scripture, there is a mother in Israel.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I was particularly Woodworth
Woodworth
Etter.
Etter, there
Yeah.
is this
Yeah.
mother in Zion. Are you going to argue with the mother in Zion who got called? Really? Are you really going to do that?
Yeah. I love it.
And Payne brilliantly brings out that male ministers would come to mother in the
Right.
same way that they
Right.
would come to Deborah, right?
Right. Now I'm gonna have to read Leah's book too,
Yes,
so
yes.
I haven't read I go away from these conversations, and I have a longer list of books
Okay.
to read all the time. But I like to read, it's good.
Yeah,
So, in the conversation, I mean, I'm you're preaching to the choir,
yeah,
really, but, I guess here's the big question for me, when we talk about all of this and talking about disruption. Um I talk to women theologians, we're talking about equality, we're talking about, all of those kinds of things, um, but it shouldn't just come from females,
yeah,
and so as a here I am, I'm the antithesis, I'm the white, male pastor. How do I personally, as a leader, how do I help disrupt this? I have 2 daughters
yeah,
that minister, that
yeah,
sing, that prophesy,
yeah,
that, and I don't want them restricted.
right.
I don't want that, held back. How do we disrupt that? Because it's still, I mean, I'd like to say it's not there, but it's still there. It's still
Yeah,
there
and
in
I
our
get asked this
Pentecostal movement.
question all the time. "Well, how do I?" And um, there is, and this is my take on it. There is a, I'm not talking personally, right? I will get to how do I, but I think
Sure.
there needs to be a recognition that there is a power dynamic that's within the
Right.
church and within
Yes.
society.
Yeah.
Everyone cannot be in power at the same time.
Right.
And if you're in power, it means that I can't be in power. And
Right.
so what I'm going
Mm.
to do is do all that I can to hold on to that power
Right. Sure.
and sideline everyone else
Mm.
who wants to be in my place, because sadly, this is the way that our society works,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so we need to recognize that in the church. We need to recognize that the ultimate power is God's, and that the
Yes.
whole thing, the whole plan is God's plan to
Yes.
reconcile humanity back to God's self. That's the plan.
Absolutely.
We didn't come up with
Yeah.
it. We're just part of it.
Right. Yeah.
And I think once we grasp that, when we grasp that we are not the initiators,
Right.
when we grasp the fact that we are ambassadors of
Hmm.
the plan,
Right. It's good. Yeah, no, I
um,
like it.
you know, and I watch ambassadors. I've had the privilege of being around ambassadors.
Mm,
Their
sure.
personal insight does not matter. Their personal
Mm,
thought about the issue do not matter.
right.
They have been given a line, and that's the line you bring. And if you choose,
Right.
you don't want to go that line, you're no longer ambassador. It's very clear. And so when we recognize as God's people that we are merely carrying a message, that's our
Mm,
job, to carry a
yeah.
message. Our job is not even to convince anybody of the message, it's just to
Right.
bring the message and to
Right. Right.
recognize that we are not God's only ambassadors.
Mm,
It's the plan that's important.
yeah, that's huge. Yeah.
Plan is it. The carrying out the plan is important.
Yeah.
And once I
Yeah.
think that I alone am the only one who can fulfill the plan, then it gets crazy. And when I
Oh,
think,
yeah.
if I begin to think that there's only 50% of us that can carry out the
Mm,
plan,
right. Sure.
then the plan is not going to be carried out because it's going to
Yeah.
take the whole to carry out the plan. And so,
That's it.
go on.
I just want to interject this because I think that's a really huge point.
Yeah.
Because when I think back to early Pentecostalism, the issue wasn't there
Exactly.
because the plan and the urgency was so strong that it was, we need everybody. We need women. We need every race. We need every gender. We need everybody involved in this because it's urgent.
Right. And so when we've mixed up what the plan is, when we've
Mm,
lost focus on what the plan actually is, when it has
yeah.
become something else, then of course, um, we become like the Israelites,
Right. Right. Right.
bowing to other plans.
Yeah. Exactly.
This plan is the most important
Exactly.
plan, and the
Yeah.
person who was
Good point.
given the plan is the most important person, and
Yeah.
then,
Yeah.
God comes in and says, well, look, you've all lost focus. I'm out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's we can laugh, but that's serious
Yeah.
business.
Yeah. And,
Yeah,
and
that's
so then
serious business.
it calls up a deliverer who
Yeah,
doesn't look like a
yeah,
deliverer, who
yeah.
looks like
Interesting.
Semple McPherson, who looks like,
So do you think that pattern is still being kind of replicated in the
oh, I
church
know
too?
so. I
Absolutely.
know so because,
Okay.
in the words of the great Rafiki, it's the circle of life.
Yeah, it's yes.
The
Well,
circle of
that is
life.
true. Yeah, that is true. I mean, God's gonna yeah, and when we get so thinking that we're it
Yes.
and,
Yeah. And so back to your
that
question of what do I do? Recognize
yes.
in ourselves, in yourself,
Mhm.
in myself, where it is that I want power. Where is it that I
Mm,
want to be recognized? I want to be
right.
recognized
Yeah, sure.
um,
Yeah,
for what I do. Are
mm,
we ready in C.S. Lewis's word, the great sin of pride? I mean, Lewis is great. I don't know.
yeah,
I'm sure you've read
sure.
his Mere Christianity.
Yeah.
When he gets to the great sin, you think it's going to be some sexual sin,
Yeah,
so,
sure. Yeah,
but it's
yeah,
pride.
it's pride.
Um,
Yeah,
and
it's pride.
it's so very subtle amongst us Christians, and yet so great,
Yeah,
as
yeah,
he said.
yeah,
And so,
uh,
whose agenda am I carrying out here?
sure.
And
Yeah,
to be clear,
yeah.
it can be the church's agenda, and the church's agenda doesn't necessarily equate to God's agenda, which is
Yeah,
unfortunate.
it is true. I mean, I'm not, I mean, we could go down a whole nother path, but I have a huge concern about how, as a church, we've developed a leadership culture instead of a servant culture.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And in that, if we're leading, we're trying to give everybody else telling everybody else what to do
Right. Rather
instead of
than
serving.
bringing more people in order to make
Mm.
the plan work, in order for the
Yeah.
plan to be fulfilled and recognize. And so as a Pentecostal, I believe wholeheartedly that the Spirit was poured out, empowering everyone in to fulfill the plan.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes. I
and
love how you
and
put.
it's a discernment amongst us
Yeah.
to recognize who is the person for this time and this moment. The
Mm.
person
Mm.
for this
Yeah.
time and this moment. Who is the person?
Yeah.
And when that discernment is colored by culture,
Sure. Yeah.
we can actually, miss it, right?
Yeah. We
And
do.
there needs to
We
be
do.
more discernment, I think. More of back in the judges that I'll put the fleece out. If it's wet, it's you. If
Yeah.
I'll turn it over. If it's dry, it's you. More of that
Yeah.
discernment rather
Mm.
than, you look the part. You've got the right haircut,
Right.
you wear the right jeans.
Right. No, that's true. That's true. You have the right
Yeah,
giftings,
exactly.
and giftings doesn't make up for lack of calling.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, 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 yes.
Interesting. No, I love it. I love it. I really enjoyed the conversation,
Thank you so
and
much.
I just feel like we could have. I just feel like there's so much more we could talk about,
Always.
and but always, always. But I had one other note, and I have to bring it near the end of your the paper that you shared with me. You talk about inequality. You said inequality is not. And what was your definition of equality?
I think I intimated to that equality for me is being able to see the work as having to be done,
Hmm. There we go.
and not and just bringing all hands on deck to get the
Right.
work done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
You sound like my wife. Let's get going.
it's being able now, again, to be able to discern who is
Mm.
the person for the moment.
Right. Right.
Um,
That's huge. That's great. That's great.
and to have elders who are willing to say, it's not me. To have
Right.
a person and, to be able to say, okay, you've called me to preach, but my daughter is the better preacher. My
Yeah.
daughter is a much better cook, much, much
Right.
better cook
Yeah.
than me. And it doesn't worry me to be able to say that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, equality is about not feeling robbed because I'm
Mm.
able to say that, she is the better preacher. She is the better leader. He
Yeah.
is, the better administrator in this case, because
Right.
at the end of the day, it's the plan. It's,
Yeah, it's the plan. That on a personal level, that's very helpful. Just as I mentioned, we're in the middle of our transitioning out of our role into new one, and all the emotions and everything that go with that.
Mhm,
I need the reminder
mhm,
that it's the plan and not the person.
mhm,
So
mhm.
I appreciate that so
You
much,
are so
and
welcome.
I
But
appreciate your
let's be very clear that, you and I, we're preaching to each other's choirs, we got that. But
time.
there's other people
That's true.
who are not on the same wavelength. They
That's
don't,
exactly right.
and so again,
Yeah,
it's discernment in how to best
yeah,
navigate that. How do we still hold what God has given us to steward
yes.
without losing sheep who
Mm,
are just about there, they're just about in the fold. And if we do this
yeah,
one thing, they might
yeah,
go.
yeah,
And so
yeah.
again,
No,
it's
it's true.
all about discerning what God is
Yeah,
doing in this time.
yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh,
I
thank
really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Ask a Theologian podcast. I hope it was a blessing to you. If you enjoy the podcast, it would just be a great help if you subscribe, hit the subscribe button, and give us a rating, like hopefully a 5-star rating or whatever. And we'd love to have that. It helps us get the word out. But also, if you've got some feedback or there's a topic you'd like to see us cover or a theologian you'd like to see us interview, why don't you shoot me an email at dave@theaskatheologianpodcast.com. That's dave@theaskatheologianpodcast.com. Looking forward to hearing from you soon. Thanks for joining. Bye for now.